The Trail of Tears, unknown by few in the Southeast, represents a time of anguish and grief for many Native Americans. Towards the beginning of the 1830s, over 125 Native Americans occupied the fertile lands of Georgia, North Carolina, Alabama, Florida, and Tennessee, but they were not the only people who wished to have control of the optimal farming areas. White settlers quickly made their way onto these lands and looked to push Native Americans out, as they were viewed more as problems than people. When the United States government first took notice of these land disputes, it was thought that the Indian people needed to be civilized by the white men. They believed that if the Indians were taught to think and act just as the white men did, then they would be able to live on the land together peacefully. The settlers, however, paid no attention to this suggestion. Instead, they destroyed Indian homes, stole Indian possessions, and took over the land that had been the property of Indians for generations. Although most state governments supported these actions, some objected by declaring that state laws had no jurisdiction over the Native American people and therefore could not be used as means of ousting them from their homes. Nevertheless, the white man's greed eventually overpowered these relatively few objections. It wasn't until 1830, when President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, that all the rumors of forcing Native Americans westward became a brutal reality. Every tribe of Native Americans living east of the Mississippi River was forced to leave the homes of their ancestors and trek hundreds of miles to an Indian reservation in modern-day Oklahoma. In most cases, they were not even allowed to bring their possessions. Thousands of men, women, and children were marched for months with little food, supplies, or government assistance in the dead of winter. Dozens of people died every day. Dysentery, whooping cough, cholera, typhus, and starvation were widespread along the infamous trail, and without any way to treat these diseases and the horrific living conditions, hundreds continued to die. Over the subsequent years, thousands of Native Americans were forced to make the trip. No tribe was exempt from the suffering, and the death toll continued to climb. Although many Indians managed to complete the trip to assigned reservation land, disease still lingered in their communities. To add to their miseries, they were also completely paralyzed by grief at the end of their journey, having lost many of their family members and friends along the way. They experienced indescribable pain, and all of this pain and suffering was attributable to a single man, Andrew Jackson. This hypocritical leader was the root of every problem these people now faced. He offered them little assistance, few resources, and no choice. Retribution was imminent. Jackson had to pay for his actions. From 1804 until his death in 1845, Jackson lived at the Hermitage, a private country mansion built on an expanse of 425 acres of land in what is now Old Hickory, Tennessee. The house was extremely beautiful and very well built. With a large number of bedrooms, exquisite living parlors, dining areas, and picturesque gardens, the Hermitage was a beautiful plantation home. Jackson and his family felt blessed to own it. However, beginning in the late 1830s, servants and guests began to have peculiar experiences within the house. Slaves working on the plantation noticed that their most profitable cash crop, cotton, was not growing near as well as usual. The wells that they used as a source of water began to run dry. Those that lived in the house were woken in the middle of the night with cold chills. Since most of these odd experiences were insignificant in and of themselves, and because many of them could be written off as coincidental, nobody paid much attention to them at first. However, over the years of Native American resettlement, when the Trail of Tears scarred the countryside, the happenings began to occur more frequently and with a much greater magnitude. The Jacksons began to experience things that could not be easily explained. It started as just a few strange noises resonating from deep within the forest adjacent to the Jackson estate. The sounds were only heard in the late evening and early morning hours. Sometimes the noises were high-pitched and shrill, like shrieks of agony. On other occasions, it sounded as if distant drums were beating wild cadences. The Jacksons naturally tried to comfort themselves by attributing the noises to some curious animal or another, but, in truth, they were all becoming increasingly unsettled. It wasn't until a few weeks later that the family realized the sinister cause of these strange occurrences. The family began to hear voices outside their house at night. At first, the words were unintelligible, but as the searches for trespassers repeatedly failed to produce any indication of evidence or trickery, Even as the voices continued to grow in both volume and intensity, it became more and more apparent that the voices belonged to the world of spirits. The words were foreign and indecipherable, but a servant in the house recognized that they were spoken in a native tongue. An old trapper who had lived for many years among the Cherokee was brought in to translate. The explanation was disquieting. There could be no mistake. The words were those of the dead. They were the words of those natives lost to the bloody trail of tears, and they were hungry for revenge. The Jacksons had no intention of running from this threat. The former president was determined to face his adversaries head-on, and he brought in several religious leaders to pray over and purify the house. A few weeks passed without incident, so the family was satisfied that the rituals had been successful. The family fell back into their normal routine with little worry. One night, however, Mr. Jackson was awakened by a terrible dream. He had dreamt that his wife, Rachel, had been killed by a strange, shadowy figure. Andrew sat up in bed and looked down on Rachel, who was peacefully asleep. Unable to fall back asleep after his disturbing dream, Jackson got up out of bed to get a sip of water from the kitchen. After leaving his room, he heard the door slam shut behind him. Although slightly startled, Andrew remained calm and went to go open the door again, but it had been locked. "Rachel?" he called out, thinking that maybe she had gotten up and locked him out in her sleep. When there was no answer, Jackson called out, louder this time, "Rachel?" Again, no response. Growing more and more worried each minute she didn't respond, Jackson furiously tried to get inside the room. After a few minutes of banging and yelling in the hallway, there came a horrible, blood-curdling scream from inside the room. Jackson was in a panic. He threw himself against the door, hoping to break it down, but to no avail. While frantically rushing around the house to find something strong enough to break into the room, Jackson heard the slow creak of his bedroom door opening. He sprinted back to his room and burst through the door, asking Rachel if she was all right, but the room was empty. As soon as he came to this realization, a cold gust of wind entered through his bedroom window, chilling him to the bone. Knowing that the window hadn't been opened in weeks, Jackson walked toward it with a sinking heart. On the floor leading up to the window, there was a trail of blood. He couldn't think. He couldn't breathe. He had to find her. Rushing outside into the cold, he heard another chilling wail coming from the direction of the garden. Running as fast as his legs could carry him, he went towards the shriek. Upon reaching the garden, Jackson found Rachel lying in a crumpled heap along the path. Kneeling down next to her, he found that she was still breathing, but barely. Her unconscious body was covered with scratches and bruises. Jackson scooped his fragile female wife into his arms and began to take her back to the house, yelling for help as he ran. Over 100 servants lived on the Hermitage plantation, but the property was eerily silent on this night. He had almost made it back to the front porch of his house when he heard voices close by. Overwhelmed with relief that someone had finally woken up to help him, he called out, "Thank God you're here. You must come quickly. Rachel's been hurt." Turning back to his wife, whose breath seemed to be getting shallower by the second, Jackson was racking his brain, trying to think of any way he knew to help Rachel. "I said come quickly," he shouted, becoming irritated that his servants weren't coming with a greater urgency. "She may not have long." When again no one came to help, he whipped around and immediately froze. Before him stood a group of long, black, human-like shadows. He realized that the voices he thought he had heard just moments ago were not his trusty servants coming to help, but the voices of the dead that had been haunting his house for weeks. These were the voices of the natives who lost their lives on the Trail of Tears, taking their revenge. After remembering all these painful details, Jackson began to plead with the shadowy figures. "What do you want from me?" he cried out. "Please, I will do whatever you ask of me. Just don't hurt my wife. Please tell me what you want." Adelecha. Before Jackson could interpret the deep, sinister voice, which was spoken in a native tongue, he was slammed to the ground by some unseen force. He wiggled and squirmed but was pinned, unable to escape the physical and emotional hell that he found himself in. He felt a cold hand fall on his throat, which began to squeeze it tighter and tighter until he could feel himself losing consciousness. The shadows were surrounding him, and believing that both his wife's and his own life was over, tears were streaming down the side of his face. The sinister voice spoke again in broken English. "We take revenge. You live with things you did." The hand that was closing Jackson's throat loosened, leaving him gasping for air. The force that had brought him down had been lifted, allowing him to raise his head to see the ghoulish figures move back towards the woods. Jackson fell unconscious on the cold ground as the sound of grim chants faded off into the distance. Both Andrew and Rachel awoke the following day, being carefully attended to by a number of doctors, nurses, family members, and servants. However, no one was quite sure what had left the couple so haggard and paralyzed with fear. The Jacksons told only a select few about their horrifying night, thinking it best not to spread their story, should people think they were crazy. Over time, the couple's physical wounds were healed. However, the Jacksons were never able to get rid of the memories that scarred their minds. The two lived for years in fear that the spirits of those who died on the Trail of Tears would return to the Hermitage to take their lives. But no ghostly happenings ever occurred again on the plantation. One could say that the two eventually learned to live a normal life, free of fear. And maybe Rachel did. But Andrew Jackson lived out the rest of his life knowing that his own actions were the reason that he and his wife almost died that horrific night. Perhaps the Native Americans knew this when they performed their deed, knew that cuts and bruises would heal, but guilt is an everlasting wound from which no one can recover.